Thieves attack an old woman without knowing the truth about her dog. In the end, they'd wish they hadn't. The rain lashed against the windows with relentless ferocity, the wind howling like a lament. Margaret, a widow of 70, stirred uneasily in her sleep as the thunder roared overhead. She had long grown accustomed to the storms that swept through the plains, but this one carried a strange weight, an unease that settled deep in her chest. Suddenly, the shrill ring of the telephone shattered the uneasy quiet of her old house. Margaret pushed back the heavy quilt and reached for her robe. Her movements were slow, her joints stiff with age, as she shuffled down the wooden staircase. By the time she reached the phone, the ringing had become an insistent intrusion on the fragile peace of the night. She picked up the receiver with a trembling hand. Mrs. Harvey. The voice on the other end of the line was unfamiliar. Her heart sank even before the next word. "We regret to inform you this way, but your son, Officer Lucas Harvey, was killed in the line of duty. I am so sorry." Margaret stood frozen, the phone slipping from her grasp and dangling by its cord. Outside, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the room for an instant, followed by a deafening clap of thunder that seemed to split the earth. The storm outside felt like an extension of the one now raging within her. She sank to the cold wooden floor, her knees giving way under the weight of the news. Images of Lucas flooded her mind, his infectious laughter as a child, the proud day he donned his police uniform, the countless evenings he'd called to assure her he was safe. He had always been her joy, her pride. Her Lucas was gone. Her only child, her legacy, the boy she had raised on her own after her husband's passing, was no more. The storm showed no sign of abating. Margaret sat quietly in the back of a police car, her umbrella forgotten at home. The rain seeped through her coat, but she didn't care. Her mind was numb, her thoughts consumed by the task ahead, identifying Lucas's body. At the hospital, the antiseptic smell turned her stomach. A nurse led her into a dimly lit room where her son lay, still and lifeless, on a metal table. Margaret's legs wavered, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Her boy, her Lucas, looked so serene, as though he might wake at any moment. But the pallor of his skin, the stillness of his chest, told her otherwise. "Oh, Lucas," she murmured, her voice barely audible, breaking under the weight of her sorrow. Her hands shook as she reached out to touch his face, her fingers brushing against his cold, lifeless skin. She half expected him to wake up, to smile at her, and tell her it was all a mistake. But no warmth remained in him. Her grief, however, was interrupted by a quiet presence at the corner of the room. A German shepherd with a glossy black coat, now dulled by rain and exhaustion, sat solemnly by Lucas's side. One of its legs was wrapped in a makeshift bandage, but the dog seemed indifferent to its own pain. Its gaze was fixed on Lucas, unwavering and filled with a sorrow Margaret couldn't ignore. "His name is Mika," said a voice from behind her. Margaret turned to see a fellow officer, his face drawn with fatigue and sorrow. He was Lucas's partner, his closest companion for 7 years. They were inseparable. Last night, Mika tried to save him, went straight for the suspect, even after being shot. He wouldn't leave Lucas, even when we pulled them out of the line of fire. Margaret knelt down, her eyes level with Mika's. She reached out a tentative hand, and the dog, despite its evident pain, leaned into her touch. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "Anyway, thank you." "You stayed with him," she whispered, tears streaming anew. "You were there when I couldn't be." Micah's ears flicked slightly, and he rested his head on her knee. In that moment, Margaret saw in the dog's eyes a reflection of her own grief. It was a grief that connected them, a shared pain for the man they both had loved and lost. The cemetery was quiet as Margaret stood by her son's grave, the umbrella in her hand, trembling slightly. The people who had come to pay their respects had left. She was alone now, or so she thought. Her eyes fell on Mika, Lucas's German shepherd lying beside the grave. The dog's head rested on the ground, his injured leg bandaged, his eyes heavy with grief. Margaret hesitated. She didn't know whether to leave him there or approach, but something in his stillness, in the way he stayed close to Lucas's resting place, drew her closer. Slowly she walked toward him, the sound of her shoes on the wet grass breaking the silence. "Micah," she said softly. He didn't lift his head, but his ears twitched slightly at her voice. She crouched down beside him, her knees protesting the motion. "You were with him, weren't you?" she said, her voice low. "All the way to the end." Her hand reached out, resting on the back of his neck. His fur was damp and cool under her touch, but he didn't move away. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Margaret sat down on the grass, setting the umbrella aside. The grey sky above seemed endless, heavy, but it no longer mattered. She spoke, her words slow and deliberate. "He said you were the bravest partner he'd ever had. Tom, the best friend a man could ask for." She paused, her fingers absently stroking the fur on his neck. "I see now he was right." Mika turned his head slightly, looking up at her. His eyes, deep and steady, met hers. Slowly, he moved closer and rested his head on her lap. Margaret felt tears sliding down her face. She didn't try to stop them. "I know," she whispered. "I miss him too." The minutes passed quietly. Margaret began to talk, her voice soft but steady. She spoke of Lucas, of the boy who used to climb trees just to prove he could, of the man who became a police officer, determined to make a difference. She spoke of her pride, her fears, and the ache that had not left her since the phone call that shattered her world. Micah stayed there, his head unmoving, listening as if he understood every word. As the light began to fade, Margaret sighed. "You can't stay here forever," she said, her hand gently brushing the fur on his head. "And I can't leave you here either." She paused, looking down at him. "Come with me. Lucas wouldn't want you to be alone, and I don't think I can do this without you." Micah shifted, lifting his head to look at her fully. After a moment he stood up, shaking the dampness from his fur. Margaret smiled faintly, pushing herself to her feet. "Let's go home." The walk back was silent. Margaret's house felt colder, emptier than it ever had before. She opened the door, stepping aside to let Micah in. He paused at the threshold, looking back at her for a moment, before stepping inside. Margaret closed the door behind him. "Welcome home," she said softly. That night, Margaret sat in her armchair, a blanket draped over her lap. Micah lay at her feet, his eyes half closed but always alert. The room was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old house and the steady sound of Mika's breathing. Margaret reached down, her hand resting lightly on his head. "We'll be okay," she said, more to herself than to him. But somehow, she felt the words held a little more truth with him there. For the first time in days, she felt the faint stirrings of something like peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The years had softened Margaret's pain. Each day she spent with Mika reminded her of Lucas, the way he used to laugh, his steadfast nature, his courage. Mika had become her constant companion, filling the spaces that were lost. One morning, the sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, falling in warm patterns on the wooden floor. Margaret stood by the stove, stirring oatmeal as the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Behind her, Mika sat near the table, his tail wagging gently against the floor. She glanced at him and smiled. "You're always there, aren't you?" she said softly. Micah's ears perked up at her voice. He let out a quiet huff, his tail thumping a little harder. Margaret laughed, shaking her head. "I suppose I'd be lost without you," she added, turning back to her cooking. After breakfast, Margaret decided to head into town to pick up a few things for Thanksgiving. She bundled up against the November chill, wrapping a scarf snugly around her neck. Micah, as always, walked beside her. His presence gave her a sense of security she hadn't realized she needed. The streets were bustling with holiday preparations, wreaths hung in shop windows, and the faint sound of carolers practicing drifted from the church. Margaret stopped at a small store selling Christmas decorations, drawn by a sparkling display of ornaments in the window. She stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. As she browsed the shelves, admiring the delicate glass baubles and handmade wreaths, she felt a prickle at the back of her neck, as though someone was watching her. Turning her head slightly, she noticed two men standing near the counter. They weren't buying anything, just talking in low voices. One of them, a burly man with a scruffy beard, glanced her way. Their eyes met briefly before he turned back to his companion, but something about the exchange unsettled her. Micah, who had been sitting quietly by the door, stood up, his ears alert. His body stiffened as he let out a low growl. Margaret frowned, her hand tightening on the shopping bag she carried. "It's okay, boy," she murmured, though her heart had begun to race. She left the store quickly, her steps brisk as she made her way back home. The unease followed her all the way to her front door. As she stepped inside and locked the door behind her, she exhaled a shaky breath. Micah stayed close, his eyes scanning the yard through the window. He circled the room several times before settling near the door, his body tense. Margaret busied herself putting away the groceries and preparing lunch, but her thoughts kept returning to the men at the store. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, a coincidence perhaps, but the image of their faces lingered. Micah's reaction had only added to her worry. That evening, as darkness settled over the neighborhood, Margaret noticed Micah pacing near the windows. Every so often he would stop and let out a low, warning growl. She walked over to him, resting a hand on his back. "What is it, boy?" she asked quietly. Outside, the wind rustled the branches of the old oak tree in the yard, but otherwise the night was still. Margaret double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before retreating to the living room. Micah, however, refused to relax. He sat by the front door, his ears twitching at every sound. Unbeknownst to Margaret, two figures stood in the shadows across the street. Jack and Luke watched the house intently, their breath visible in the cold night air. Jack, the taller of the two, spoke in a low voice. "She's alone. Just her and that dog." Luke nodded, his eyes fixed on the faint light coming from Margaret's window. "We'll wait," he replied. "Make our move when it's quiet." Micah shifted, his gaze locked on the darkened street outside. Margaret noticed his unease and sat down beside him, her hand resting on his head. "It's just the wind," she said, more to herself than to him. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the cold wind. Inside the small house, Margaret was fast asleep. Micah lay near the front door, his head resting on his paws, but his ears twitching at every faint sound. His body was calm, but his eyes never fully closed. Across the street, hidden in the shadows, Jack and Luke exchanged quick whispers. They had been watching Margaret's house for days, convinced it held a treasure worth the risk. The insurance money her son had left behind was all the motivation they needed. To them, Margaret was an easy target, an old woman, alone in a quiet neighborhood. It seemed like the perfect plan. "Let's go," Jack said, his voice barely audible. Luke hesitated but nodded. Together they crept toward the house, the faint glint of tools in their hands. The lock on the front door resisted at first, but Jack's persistence paid off. The click of the lock giving way seemed loud in the quiet night. Inside, Micah's ears shot up. He stood instantly, his body tense, his nose sniffing the air. A low growl rumbled in his throat, deep and steady. He moved to Margaret's bedroom and let out a series of sharp, urgent barks. Margaret stirred, confused and disoriented, as the noise pulled her from sleep. "Micah?" she called, sitting up and fumbling for the bedside lamp. The dog barked again, louder this time, and Margaret's heart quickened. She could hear it now, a faint sound, the creak of the front door opening. Fear surged through her. Someone was in the house. "Micah, stay close," she whispered, her voice trembling. Grabbing her phone, she dialed the police with shaky fingers, her eyes darting toward the hallway. Jack and Luke stepped inside cautiously, their movements careful as they scanned the dimly lit room. "Keep quiet," Jack muttered. But before they could take another step, a dark shape launched toward them with a speed they hadn't anticipated. Micah was on Jack in an instant. His jaws clamped down on Jack's arm with precision, a ferocity that left no room for hesitation. Jack let out a scream, the sound cutting through the air as he dropped the crowbar he had been holding. Blood dripped from his arm, the injury deep and merciless. "Get him off me!" Jack yelled, panic overtaking his voice. Luke froze, his eyes wide as he watched Micah's relentless attack. He hesitated, torn between helping his friend and running for his life. Micah's growls were low and constant, his focus unshakable. Jack's attempts to shake the dog off were futile, his strength no match for Micah's determination. Margaret, clutching her phone, peeked out from the hallway. Her heart raced as she saw the scene unfold. Micah, her protector, was defending her with every ounce of strength he had. For a moment she was frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Then she saw the second intruder, Luke, standing indecisively near the door. Luke took a step back, his fear growing with every second. "We've got to get out of here," he finally shouted, his voice cracking. "He's going to kill us." Jack, still struggling under Micah's grip, groaned in pain. "Help me," he pleaded, but Luke had already made his decision. Turning, he bolted for the door, leaving Jack behind. Micah released Jack only when he tried to follow. The dog leaped again, forcing Jack to stumble backward. Realizing he was outmatched, Jack clutched his bleeding arm and scrambled after Luke, the two of them disappearing into the darkness as quickly as they had come. The house fell silent again, except for Margaret's ragged breaths and Micah's steady growls as he stood by the door, his body still on high alert. Margaret dropped to her knees, her hands shaking as she reached for him. "Oh, Micah," she whispered, her voice breaking. She wrapped her arms around him, her tears soaking into his fur. "You saved me." Micah let out a soft whine, his body finally relaxing as he felt Margaret's touch. He licked her hand gently, his eyes meeting hers with a calm assurance. Margaret held him close, feeling the warmth of his presence. At that moment, she knew Lucas had left her more than just a dog. Micah was her protector, her guardian, and her connection to the son she had lost. For the rest of the night, Margaret sat beside him, her hand resting on his head. She didn't sleep, but for the first time in days, she didn't feel completely alone. Margaret sat in her armchair, the phone trembling slightly in her hand. The officer on the other end had been calm and reassuring, but his words didn't do much to ease the tight knot in her chest. She had explained everything: how the men had broken in, how Mika had fought them off, and how she had barely managed to call for help. The police had promised to patrol the area more frequently, but the fear lingered, heavy and constant. After hanging up, she looked at Mika lying by her feet. His ears were alert, his gaze fixed on the front door as though expecting the intruders to return at any moment. Margaret reached down, her hand brushing his fur. "You saved me, Mika," she said softly. "But I don't think we're safe, just yet." The next day, Margaret made arrangements to strengthen the house. A locksmith came and replaced the front and back door locks with sturdier ones. A technician installed an alarm system showing Margaret how to set it each night before she went to bed. She nodded, paying careful attention, though her mind wandered. She couldn't shake the image of those men, cold, determined, and furious as they fled into the night. Mika watched every visitor with sharp eyes, never moving far from Margaret's side. Even as the house became more secure, his vigilance never wavered. Each night he paced the rooms, his ears twitching at the faintest sound. Margaret often found herself listening too, her heart racing at every creak and groan of the old house. She would glance at Mika, his tense posture a constant reminder of the danger that still lingered. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit apartment across town, Jack paced back and forth, his injured arm wrapped in a sling. His partner, Luke, sat slumped on a worn-out couch, nursing a bruise on his jaw. The tension between them was palpable. "That dog," Jack growled, his voice low. "He ruined everything." Luke shrugged, his eyes fixed on the floor. "We should just leave it alone." "It's not worth it." Jack spun to face him, his expression twisted with anger. "Not worth it? That mutt humiliated us." He slammed his good fist against the wall, the dull thud echoing in the small room. "No, this isn't over." Luke looked up, his face uncertain. "And what are you going to do?" "That dog's not normal, Jack. He won't go down easy." Jack's lips curled into a cold smile. "Then we take him out first. No dog, no problem." Luke hesitated, but Jack's determination was unyielding. They began to plan, their anger fueling a reckless sense of resolve. This time, they wouldn't leave empty-handed. That evening, Margaret sat by the fireplace, knitting quietly. The rhythmic click of the needles was soothing, a small comfort in the uneasy quiet of the house. Mika lay on the rug, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the room with quiet intensity. Margaret put her knitting aside and looked at him. "You haven't relaxed since that night, have you?" she asked. Her voice was gentle, but it carried a note of worry. "You're waiting for something. I can feel it." Mika lifted his head slightly, his ears flicking at a sound from outside. Margaret tensed, listening closely. A moment passed in silence before Mika settled back down, though his posture remained alert. Margaret sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she murmured. She thought about Lucas then, as she often did. She wondered what he would have done in her place, how he would have handled the fear and uncertainty that seemed to hover over the house like a storm cloud. The thought brought a pang of sadness, but also a strange sense of comfort. Lucas had always been brave, always ready to protect those he cared about, and now Mika carried that same unwavering loyalty. Outside, the night deepened. The streets were quiet, the air heavy with the stillness that comes before something breaks. Margaret tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, the steady presence of Mika, but a feeling of unease crept over her, refusing to be ignored. Mika stood suddenly, his body stiff, his ears perked toward the door. Margaret froze, her heart pounding as she followed his gaze. "What is it, Micah?" she whispered. The dog didn't move, his eyes fixed on something Margaret couldn't see. She reached for the remote and turned off the television, plunging the room into silence. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, but there was something else, a faint, unfamiliar sound that sent a chill down her spine. Margaret reached out to stroke Mika's fur, her hand shaking slightly. "Whatever it is," she said softly, "we'll face it together." The rain fell in steady sheets, drumming against the windows of Margaret's old house. The storm, relentless and cold, masked the sound of quiet footsteps approaching through the wet grass. Inside, Margaret sat in her chair, her fingers resting on the edge of the blanket draped over her lap. Micah lay by the door, his ears twitching with every gust of wind. His eyes were half closed, but Margaret could tell he wasn't asleep. Suddenly, Micah's head lifted. His body stiffened, his ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Margaret froze. She followed his gaze to the door and felt the familiar knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Something wasn't right. Before she could move, the faint sound of metal scraping against the lock confirmed her worst fears. "Micah," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but her hands moved quickly, grabbing the phone from the table beside her. She pressed the emergency number, her fingers shaky but precise. A click, then a crash. The front door swung open violently, revealing two men drenched from the rain. Jack, holding a small electroshock weapon, stepped in first, followed by Luke, gripping a metal rod. "Don't make this hard, lady," Jack said, his voice sharp and cold. "We're here for what you've got. Stay quiet, and no one gets hurt." Micah sprang forward, his growl turning into a ferocious bark. He launched himself at Jack, his jaws snapping dangerously close. But before he could land, the sharp crackle of the electroshock weapon filled the air. Micah yelped and crumpled to the ground, his body convulsing. Margaret cried out, her heart breaking at the sight. "No, leave him alone," she shouted, her voice shaking but firm. Jack smirked, his grip tightening on the weapon. "Stay out of this, old lady, unless you want the same." Margaret, her hands trembling, stepped forward. "You don't understand," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The police are already on their way. You won't get away with this." Luke scoffed, swinging the rod lightly in his hand. "We'll be long gone before they show up. Now where's the money?" Micah lay on the ground, his breaths shallow but steady. Even in his weakened state, he let out a low, defiant whine. Jack glanced down at the dog and sneered. "He's not done yet," he muttered, raising the rod high. Margaret's voice broke as she stepped between Jack and Micah. "Please," she begged, her eyes glistening with tears. "I'll give you everything, money, jewelry, anything you want. Just don't hurt him." Jack hesitated, his greed outweighing his anger. He exchanged a glance with Luke, who nodded. "Show us," he said, motioning with the rod. Margaret led them slowly to her bedroom, her mind racing. Her fingers fumbled as she opened the safe, revealing cash and a few pieces of jewelry. The men's eyes gleamed as they grabbed the contents, their focus entirely on the valuables. But Margaret wasn't looking at them. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, where Mika's shadow stirred. The dog was standing now, his legs unsteady but determined. She saw the spark of resolve in his eyes and felt a surge of hope. Jack turned, clutching a fistful of cash. "Let's get out of—" he began, but his words were cut off by a blur of movement. Micah, with all the strength he could muster, leapt at Jack, knocking him backward. The two tumbled down the narrow staircase, Jack's head striking the railing with a sickening thud. He lay motionless at the bottom. "Micah!" Margaret cried, her hands flying to her mouth. But the dog wasn't done. He turned, his body low and tense, and charged at Luke, who was too slow to react. Micah's weight knocked him off balance, sending him crashing into the bedroom wall. The rod clattered to the floor as Luke groaned in pain, clutching his side. The sound of sirens cut through the storm. Red and blue lights flashed outside, and moments later, officers burst through the door. "Freeze!" one of them shouted, their weapons trained on Luke, who raised his hands in surrender. Margaret rushed to Micah, her knees hitting the floor beside him. Her hands stroked his fur, her voice soft and trembling. "You did it, Micah. You saved us." An officer knelt beside them, his gaze shifting from Micah to Margaret. "That's one brave dog you've got there, ma'am." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He's more than brave. He's all I have left of my son." As the officers secured Jack and Luke, Margaret stayed with Micah, her hands never leaving his side. She whispered words of gratitude and love, her heart full despite the fear that still lingered. By the time the chaos subsided, the storm outside had begun to wane. Margaret sat in her chair once more, Micah resting at her feet. She looked down at him, her hand gently brushing his head. "Lucas would be so proud of you," she said softly. Micah's tail gave a faint wag, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Margaret smiled. The ceremony was simple yet heartfelt, held in the same police station where Lucas had once worked. Margaret stood quietly at the back of the room, her hands folded neatly in front of her, watching as officers in their crisp uniforms gathered to honor a dog who had become more than just a partner to their fallen comrade. Micah sat beside her, his large, steady form a comforting presence. He seemed unaware of the attention, his dark eyes fixed on Margaret, as if to reassure her he was right there. The police chief stepped forward, a small medal gleaming in his hands. His voice was steady, but carried a note of respect that made Margaret's heart swell. "Micah served alongside Officer Lucas Harvey for 7 years, he began. "He was not just a dog. He was a protector, a friend, and a hero. Even after losing his partner, Micah continued to protect the one Lucas loved most. Today we recognize his bravery, loyalty, and the bond he shared with Lucas." Margaret felt her throat tighten as the chief bent down to place the medal around Micah's neck. The weight of the moment pressed on her as tears welled up, but she didn't wipe them away. Micah sat still, his tail giving a slow wag, as if sensing the importance of the gesture. The officers and neighbors in attendance broke into quiet applause, a sound filled with admiration and gratitude. Later, as Margaret and Micah made their way back home, the afternoon sunlight seemed warmer than usual. A few neighbors who had attended the ceremony stopped by the house, bringing flowers, small gifts, and kind words. "He's a remarkable dog," Mrs. Reed, the elderly woman from across the street, said, patting Micah on the head. "And you're lucky to have each other." Margaret nodded, her smile faint but genuine. "He's more than remarkable," she replied. "He's a part of Lucas, and for that I'll always be grateful." As the last visitor left and the house grew quiet again, Margaret turned to Micah, who was lying on the rug near the fireplace. "You've had quite a day, haven't you?" she said gently. The dog lifted his head, his ears perked up, and his eyes followed her as she moved into the kitchen. Margaret opened a cupboard and took out a can of beef stew, one she'd been saving for a special occasion. "I think today counts," she murmured to herself. She prepared the meal with care, adding a few scraps of roast chicken from the previous night's dinner. Micah watched her the whole time, his tail thumping softly against the floor in anticipation. Margaret couldn't help but chuckle. "Lucas used to look at me the same way when he wanted a snack," she said, setting the bowl down in front of him. "Go on, it's all yours." As Mika ate, Margaret sat back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the framed photo of Lucas on the mantel. She felt a familiar pang of loss, but it was gentler now, softened by the presence of the dog who had become her companion. "Thank you, Mika," she said softly, though he didn't look up, "for everything." That evening, Margaret took her usual spot on the porch with a cup of tea in hand. The air was cool, and the sky above was clear, the stars scattered like tiny lanterns in the dark. Micah sat beside her, the medal still hanging from his neck, catching the faint light. She reached down and stroked his fur, her fingers moving slowly, thoughtfully. "You know," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper, "Lucas would have been so proud of you today. He always said you were the best partner he could have asked for." And he was right. Mika turned his head slightly, resting it on her lap as she continued. "When I look at you, I see him. Not just in the way you protect me, but in the way you care. He's still here, Micah, through you." The dog's steady breathing was the only response, but it was enough. Margaret looked up at the stars, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I think we'll be all right," she said, almost as if Lucas could hear her. "As long as we have each other, we'll be just fine." The night passed slowly, peacefully. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a sense of completeness she hadn't thought possible. Mika stayed close, his warm presence a reminder of the love and protection that still surrounded her. And as the stars above twinkled softly, Margaret knew that Lucas's legacy lived on, not just in memories, but in the steadfast loyalty of the dog who had never stopped loving him, and who now loved her just as fiercely. And that's the story of Mika and Margaret, a tale of love, loss, and the unbreakable bond that carried them through. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, connection and loyalty can light the way forward. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a special bond with a pet or someone who helped you heal during a difficult time? Share your stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and who knows, your story might just inspire someone else watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more heartfelt stories, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next video. Thank you for spending your time here with me today. Stay safe, stay kind, and I'll see you in the next one.